Now we're going to move into some of the grades and comparisons so you can know how to specify and get the grade you want. One of your handouts is going to be an article called Antique Shopping Out of Hardwood Floors to give you all these definitions. But you can see three distinct grain patterns in this corner cabinet in the antique heart pine. The curly grain up in the top, bonnet, and the old Forester from the plantation in Thomasville will tell me that he doesn't really know what causes that. It's not the same as the Pecky cypress that's caused when a branch would break off up high and worms and water would make their way down the cypress tree. The curly pine, they think, is an inherited trait, because he says when he finds one log in the forest with bumps on the outside of the tree, he finds several more close by. We recently provided a good bit of single bead siding for the Charnley Norwood house in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, one of Frank Lloyd Wright's first homes that was restored after Hurricane Katrina. You can see the vertical grain in this image, and these floors would have been the choice for the Victorian homes prior to the existence of modern dry kilns. We use dehumidification as a very slow method to render the highest quality of wood. But it takes a larger log and wastes a little wood to saw for the vertical grain pattern with the growth rings no more than 45 degrees perpendicular to the face. And the reason they would have used this grade is because it tends to shrink and swell less than the Pleinson. Now, 6 inches is really wide for vertical grain. It's pretty hard to get wider than that in the pine in particular. The Pleinson has the distinct arches in the heart pine, and in the case of the heart cypress, a much more subtle grain pattern, but still the swirls and the cathedral arches, and a little easier to get wide boards. We've talked about the curly heart pine. That's quite rare. One board out of every 400 or 500 logs might be curly, and it's just the outer board of the log. We make furniture, in this case, after the George Nakashima style. This designer wanted to see the wane of the tree and the trestle members and the axe marks where the tree was cut in the feet of this partner's desk. This designer wanted some craftsman columns and a few boards of the dark wood to outline her bedroom. We first found the midnight heart pine in the Savannah River when Oglethorpe took the center of the tree, where the pith of the tree, and made pretty small pilings, maybe 6 inches, 8 inches at most, and then pounded them into the river bottom. And the wood is actually a browner color from that wonderful clay river. Makes a beautiful floor. Papa Hemingway's house in Key West needed a new vertical grain floor after some hurricanes there. Here's a wild cherry floor that has a good bit of mineral streaking and figure that you don't typically see in Appalachian cherry or cherry grown further in the north. It has to struggle to grow more down here in the south. We do the hand-hewn beams or the columns if you want a rustic look or something very natural. Today they can take a considerable bit of labor with an adze to get this look, and once this was the way people had to cut these beams before they had the big saws. You can get any stair part you want. It used to be relatively expensive to make knives. Today with modern CAD we can provide any molding pattern that you need to match for historic restoration. And here's George with a load of very long beams. Now typically the joists and columns in these old Industrial Revolution era warehouses were only about 24 feet long. We recently had to provide some very long structural beams to a new town center called Brownwood in the Villages. But I want you to remember these long beams. I'll tell you a story at the end of the presentation that an architect friend told me about having to find some of these. These are quite rare. Here's some building reclaimed heart pine in the newly restored Custom House in Key West. They wanted some nail holes in the floor to match what was in the rest of the building. And one of my favorite grades, I love the character with the nail stain, maybe some bolt holes, cracks and checks. Everybody is different in reclaimed wood. This has a lot of energy, and other people may not find it useful. It's a more economical option. So how do you know it's really antique? Well, just based on the age of the wood. There's also, the last time these specifications were published for heart pine, required at least 6 growth rings an inch on average. Now, a growth ring is this pair of light and dark, and the light wood is the spring wood or early wood, where it's a little easier for the tree to grow. The dark portion is the summer wood or the late wood, and this is where most of the oleo resin is built up. So you do want to specify at least 6 growth rings an inch, and in the case of heart pine, it really should be mostly heartwood. We don't call it heart pine if it's not mostly all heartwood. Old growth can have a relative meaning today. The longleaf pine at 40 or 50 years is pretty much going to be the rotation time when you're going to want to cut the forest and get your return on the investment. Even a 75 to 90-year-old longleaf pine tree may still be only 30% heartwood. So we're just not going to see the slow growing conditions for this old wood anymore. The heartwood is definitely photoreactive. When the wood is first sawn, it's a much lighter color. And then after it's like this, and then after it's exposed to light for some period of time, it's going to turn the rich red color that you're accustomed to for heart pine. The outer boards or the sapwood boards will not turn that red color. It's still a beautiful option, and again a more economical option if you need historical wood. So again, your handouts are going to include a lot of definitions. I'll also send you photos and a cross-match puzzle so you can guess some of these specifications and make it easy for you to actually see what we mean by quarter sawn. Not all quarter sawn wood has the vertical grain. Wide planks can sometimes be called 60 to 75% vertical, referring to the pinstripes on the side of the board, but it's actually all plain sawn. And kiln drying really is an essential part of reclaimed wood. Even though it's been out in the atmosphere for 100 or more years, it's going to be drier inside than it is outside, and kiln drying is the only way you can guarantee your clients that they're not going to receive any mold or any insects. When we saw the reclaimed beams or the river recovered logs, we carefully air dry the wood down to about the mid-teens and then put it in the dry kiln, dry it slowly down to 6 to 8% moisture content, so that you're getting wood that you can acclimate to whatever you expect the average temperature and relative humidity to be in your building, and get it installed properly for the long term. You definitely want to get a guarantee of your grade in writing. We're going to talk some about the knots in the nail holes and some of these characteristics in these old woods, and they'll be in your definitions. We talked about the late wood and early wood and looking for the growth ring counts and getting a product that you guarantee graded to these established standards. You might expect to use a little more sandpaper. We're going to hand you out a 22-page manufacturer's guideline that will give a lot of specifications. We do have a sample master specification which we can modify for every project and every site condition to make sure these floors go in well for the long term. Costs vary anywhere from under $5 to over $20, and they probably average for reclaimed wood around $8 or $9 a square foot. It does cost more to reclaim the wood, and then it's a slower process to saw the wood carefully. These are all trees that are hundreds of years old, so they've been through some windstorms, have some internal fracture, and it does take more time to render the best yield and the highest quality.